Hi, I'm Bruce Walton from Road Safety Analysis, and this is the 7th in my series of 10 bite-sized demonstrations of my favourite things which MAST can do. In this clip, I'm going to analyse casualties by the type of vehicle with which they were associated. And now there's some very useful work that you can do, and it's a common type of analysis that people often require when they're planning road safety interventions. But there are some pitfalls along the way that I'd like to point out to you. Now, here we are in MAST, and I'm going to go into a casualties blank report to create an example of a casualty report which is related to vehicle type. And the very first thing I'd like to point out is that you have a choice of fields that you can use for this purpose. I'm going to go on to the filter tab. I've got it in mind to filter my report by vehicle type, and I'm going to click on Add Dimension. I would like to point out the choice of dimensions that you've got. There's a dimension called Casualty Type of Related Vehicle, and there are also separately dimensions called Crash Involved Vehicle and then various different vehicle types. Now, for the purposes of this bite size, I'm going to use the Casualty Type of Related Vehicle dimension. That gives me the vehicle type that was related to every individual casualty. I'll come back to the crash-involved ones in a future bite size. So let's say, for example, I needed to do an analysis on casualties who had been run over by goods vehicles. I'm going to click on OK, and in my casualty type of related vehicle dimension that I've now added onto the filter tab, I'm going to filter by goods vehicles. If I drill down into motor there, I've got goods vehicles, so I'm going to select goods vehicles, click on OK. There we go. So that's all casualties related to goods vehicles. But the thing you need to be careful about when you use the casualty type of related vehicle dimension is that not all of those casualties are going to be pedestrians. Some of them will be drivers of goods vehicles, some of them will be passengers in goods vehicles. In order to illustrate this point, I'm going to go onto the Columns tab and I'm going to add the Casualty Class dimension. That will be familiar to a lot of people. It tells you how each individual casualty came to be involved in the crash. When I click on OK, you can see that all the casualties are divided between in-vehicle casualties and pedestrian casualties. So, of all those casualties that are associated with goods vehicles, nearly 60,000 of them over the 6-year period we've got, only about 12,000 are pedestrians. The rest were people who were in the goods vehicle at the time they were injured. I'm going to filter out the vehicle occupants, so I'm left with only the pedestrians in my report. So now I've got a report which is about pedestrians who were first struck by a goods vehicle when a crash occurred. Now, when you're trying to narrow down a particular road user type like this and understand the factors which are at risk, this gives you an opportunity to play with the full range of things which MAST makes available to you. Now, if I go on to the Rows tab, I presently have on there the crash date dimension, which is analysing this by year. That's not a terribly interesting trend. I'm going to remove the crash date dimension and add something more interesting instead. First of all, I'm going to have a look at one which sheds quite a lot of light on goods vehicles, the Casualty Tow of Related Vehicle dimension, which will allow me to distinguish between articulated vehicles, vehicles pulling trailers, and vehicles that had no tow or articulation at the time of the crash. And there you can see the number of pedestrians run over by articulated vehicles in the period that is covered. There's one example of an interesting piece of information that you could use to identify trends in different areas depending on a variable which you thought might be relevant. I might look at that and decide that I don't think tow is relevant, so I'm going to remove it and I'm experimentally going to add something else. I'm going to try, for example, the Casualty Manoeuvre of Related Vehicle field, which allows me to look at the manoeuvre that the goods vehicle was undertaking at the time when it hit the pedestrian. An interesting trend there you can see is that a very large proportion of those were hit by manoeuvring goods vehicles, that is, goods vehicles that were reversing or stopping or starting by the side of the road. and that's a trend that in some areas might be significant that you might want to follow up. So you can see how easy it is when you're trying to put your finger on what is the most relevant factor, how easy it is to add a dimension, have a look at it, decide whether you think it's useful, and if you don't, then remove it. So I'm going to remove casualty manoeuvre of related vehicle now, and I'm going to have a look at one more thing that I think might be relevant to pedestrians being struck by goods vehicles. I want to look at the background of the driver, and if I click on Add Dimension, I've got down here Casualty Mosaic for related driver. That is the mosaic group of the goods vehicle driver who was in charge of the vehicle at the time when the collision occurred. And there you can see that there's quite a marked differences between the different mosaic groups as to the provenance of the goods vehicle driver. Another interesting thing that you can do, people might be inclined to assert that lorry drivers are necessarily male, but that's very easy to test. If I go onto the Columns tab and I add Casualty Gender of Related Driver, I can see how many of those goods vehicle drivers that struck pedestrians were in fact female. If I drill down into there, we can see that the assertion that the majority of goods vehicle drivers are male does in fact turn out to be true. But at least this way you can base an analysis, if you're targeting leaflets to make lorry drivers aware of the danger of pedestrians when they're reversing with vehicles with restricted visibility, you do need to be thinking about targeting males in certain socio-demographic groups. This allows you to base the design of interventions on facts rather than on guesses. Well, that's it for this bite size. In my next bite size clip, I'm going to be returning to the feature of talking about looking at casualty figures in relation to vehicle type, but this time I'm going to look at the crashes involving vehicle fields.